Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to D&I One-on-One, a bi-weekly webinar series where we talk about different topics, one subject at a time, all things D&I related. My name is Jina Etienne. I am the creator and host of this series. I'm a certified diversity executive, and I focus on something I call fearless inclusion. And I define that as the freedom to be yourself and the ability to create space for others to do the same. And my work is framed around that idea with the goal of helping people facilitate conversations and have programs focused on connecting, mindfulness, and self-awareness so that we can do just that. And I'm really excited about today's program because navigating differences that we can sometimes be surprised by is part of the challenge of trying to navigate a world that is increasingly diverse. So we're going to jump into that a little bit, but first, let me introduce my guest today is Adrianna Flax, founder and owner of AM Flax Consulting, a diversity, equity, and inclusion consulting firm that helps clients make diversity their differentiator in the competition for talent, mind share, and market share. She provides training, DEI executive coaching, keynote speaking, and strategic consulting to Fortune 500 companies, small and mid-sized businesses, nonprofits, governments, higher education, you name it, and she helps them. She uses her intersectional identity, passion, and humor to deeply connect with clients and audiences. She's Jewish, Latina, proudly part of the LGBTQ plus community, and has a facial difference. All of that shapes her lens and her work. And I just learned that you also are a comedian. Please tell us more. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, actually, I have a background in stand-up comedy and improv comedy from several years back, but I usually hesitate to tell people that because then they have very high expectations for the comedy coming out of the session. So take what you find to be funny, but today we're really going to talk about my lived experience with a facial difference. And so sometimes there can be humor in that, and but it's definitely a broader kind of picture of experience.
So let me see. Let me know. I want to do the first polling question fairly soon. So I'm not sure when you want to do that, but let me know because we want to make sure we spread them out over the course of the webinar. But let's just jump right in. When we first talked about doing the webinar, you actually talked about facial differences and your birthmark. And I remember thinking, what are you talking about? What birthmark? And I'm looking and I'm trying to see it. And in your experience, some people notice it and some people don't. So can you set up for us the whole conversation around facial differences? How did we get here?
Yeah, so interestingly, when you and I were talking about topics for this sort of web series, I had said I would love to talk about facial differences, and you were very, open and kind and polite, but had no idea why I wanted to talk about facial differences. And interestingly, usually we would have to note this nowadays, but we met in person first, right? We met in person in the world, and I assume most people have seen or noticed my birthmark, and you hadn't, which was very interesting. And then we got to talking a great deal about having a facial difference. I kind of said, this is who I am. This is, if you can see it more effectively in this situation. And you kind of said, wow, that's so interesting. I hadn't noticed. And I wonder why, and there can be things about the other person's experiences where they notice these differences or they don't. But for me, it's been something that's extremely formative throughout my life. And it is an aspect of identity and of our differences that really goes overlooked in terms of its impact and weight in our lives, and then how we are treated in the world.
So maybe we can start by talking about the fact that when we see people, we naturally and automatically classify them. We put them into categories, and those categories are organized either around the things that we know, the things that we've experienced, or different dimensions of our own identity, some of which are visible and some of which are invisible. What has that experience been like for you? How does that relate to the topic today?
Yeah, so I think being perceived is sort of a universal experience, and some of us are perceived for our differences first. And some of us are perceived for our full identity and our totality, or whatever it is we sort of present as. So I put on lipstick today, right? So the first thing you might see is, oh, there's a woman, she has glasses, she's wearing lipstick. But if you notice my birthmark, it's the very first thing you then often perceive about me. And I'm glad you put up this slide to make it much more clear. And then there's also, photos where if I'm not wearing makeup, or if it's, a photo from the beach, for example, because sun exposure increases the darkness of the melanated part of my skin, then it's the first thing you notice. So that experience of being perceived and of watching someone else perceive you is something that we only experience, or oftentimes only experience in our difference. Just like if you're the only woman who walks in a room of men, you see yourself being perceived. My sister is a physician, and she did an explosives course because she was an emergency disaster physician. And of 42 people in the room, she said, everyone noticed when I walked in because I was the only woman. So it's that seeing yourself in the reflection of someone else. And then having a birthmark really punctuates that regularly.
Well, now that we've shown everyone visually your difference, let's invite everybody to take this first poll, which is, what is your reaction to this difference? So we'll open that up.
Yes, that first poll is live on your screen. As a reminder, there'll be 4, and you need to answer at least 3 of them to earn full credit. I'll leave them open for a minute to make sure everyone has an opportunity to vote.
I have about 40 seconds here, Adrianna, to chatter. And I guess one of the things that you just brought up for me is when you notice you're the one, that's different. And I think it's interesting because you said 2 things, and maybe we can circle back on them as soon as the poll closes. One, noticing your own difference when you are in a room. I'm assuming from your comment, the rest of the room's homogenous or relatively homogenous. And so is that why we notice our differences? Or could it be, and certainly from your own experience, we are noticing them noticing us? So let's see what everybody says first, and then I don't know if you want to take those on when we come back.
Sure.
Yeah, closing this one down here for you in 3, 2, and 1, sharing those results. Would you like me to read them, or can you see them?
I can see 26% said it's not a big deal. 38% said they're totally accepting. 16% unsure, and then 10% say they see it as a benefit or a strength.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's, again, in that reflection. Some of us have experience with somebody with another difference that is similar enough in terms of being perceived that we say, I see this as a unique characteristic and quality of you that makes you special. For example, I've had friends who, have a sibling who is disabled, physically disabled, and they walk into a room and they notice everyone noticing. And they say, but I don't see this as even a limitation. I rather see it as a characteristic that makes the person especially important, valuable in their lived experience as such. But, also the difference isn't a big deal. That response can come in 2 ways. That can be, I don't see the difference being anything of note or anything, of, concern. And then the other way that can come through, depending on how I've experienced it, is people maybe not recognizing how profound the experience can be living with a difference, right? So it's not a big deal, meaning maybe we don't understand how much of a weight it can carry. So yeah, I've definitely gotten a variety of these reactions in the past, or unsure and unfamiliar. And I really want to point out that 16%, that's really common. Because if you think, how many people in your life have you met with a very visible birthmark, right? And you might say, oh, I met somebody once with a hemangioma, so more of a red raised birthmark. But I haven't met anybody with your type of birthmark, right? Or I had a family member. But if you don't have those people in your proximity, and if they're not necessarily represented as often in the media, we just don't have the familiarity. So it's pretty common.
Now, I find it interesting that you say that, because as I reflect back on my own experiences, a couple things. My son, he has a birthmark on his shoulder, and it's blue-ish. Well, I mean, as he's gotten browner, it's sort of changed its tone. But when he was born, I actually thought he had a bruise on his shoulder, and it would go away in time. And then eventually I realized, oh, that's just a birthmark. And I noticed it, I processed it, and I didn't do anything else with it. And maybe it's because I know for me, I have, I'm going to call them dots all over my body. And I don't know that they qualify as freckles, but I have them. Um, and there's just been so many little things like that that I've seen over the years that maybe it becomes invisible. And I don't know that that's a good thing, actually. Is it?
Mm.
I mean, what does it feel like for you if you notice me noticing and I don't say something? So I'm familiar enough with differences, but then yours kind of catches me by surprise. And sometimes I can't play that off. People might try to, but struggle with that.
Yeah, that happens with me and with people with a variety of facial differences, is that it's the difference is not necessarily common or familiar enough for a person to immediately categorize that person, right? It's like, okay, I see this person and I, categorize them, they're South Asian. I see this person and I categorize them, they're in a wheelchair, they're disabled. But when you see a facial difference, oftentimes you're trying to discern what you're looking at, right? So I've had people, ask if it's makeup, ask if it's a burn or a scar. And so interestingly, I think what I've taken away from so many different experiences of people's perceptions is there's not one right way, but I think, to say to notice or to not notice, to acknowledge or to not acknowledge. I think the thing that ties together all of the responses that really were positive for me is that it says there's some level of candor, but acceptance and acknowledgement. And I think those things are really helpful, but oftentimes those aren't the first things I want to talk to you about. Those might be once we get to know each other a little bit more.
Yeah. Well, so I want to pull this slide up because you talked about things that I might be familiar with or unfamiliar with, and you've also talked about it from the perspective of how you see yourself. And we were, just before we came on the air, we were talking about hiding or blending in. And some of our differences are visible to everybody, and some of our differences we can choose to show. I don't know that this is, I'm about to say something, I'm like, is this even the right thing I should say? But I mean, for you, for example, putting on makeup, I don't know what type of makeup is out there in the marketplace that can completely mask it, so you can't see it at all. And if that is an option, you may or may not choose to do it because some of this is who you are. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, it's interesting. When I was a teenager, I always searched for that makeup, and it tended towards something that was akin to stage makeup, if you've ever been in theater or been around people in theater. And it was really ineffective and just made things maybe a bit more problematic or noticeable. And what I was seeking then was not to hide. What I was seeking was the ability to blend in if I chose to. And I think people with a really visible difference that they see people see all the time, or they get reactions to. Oftentimes people are surprised when I tell them the variety of reactions, especially the negative ones that I've gotten, ever since being a child, but then also adults, even as a child, adults making really, really terrible comments, or jumping to a conclusion, or a woman reacting very poorly and then saying, oh, I'm so sorry. And I thought she was truly expressing remorse. And she said, I'm so sorry that you have to live like that. So
Wow.
having all of those experiences, it's a tremendous amount of mental work for the person who experiences the difference to have to explain, to have to self-advocate all the time. So sometimes in seeking that makeup or that thing, it's the ability to say, I'm not going to do that work right now. I'm going to blend in. But since that time, maybe as a young teenager, I really never sought that out anymore. I don't wear any makeup that's any different than any makeup anybody else wears. I don't buy anything special because to me, it's something I'm proud of. it's something that I say, okay, I'd rather take on the emotional, mental work of navigating difference than of making the effort to blend in. But my experience is not every experience of a person with a facial difference.
So it's interesting because when you look at the identity iceberg, there are things that what I'm hearing you saying, I'm actually looking at my slide over here as opposed to talking to the window. I can see for you, you can be above the line, below the line. And below the line might be something I might notice, but it's subtle versus deep down where I will never notice it because you've done a wonderful job of covering it so that you do blend in, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And so is there anything in particular that might drive you to do a certain thing? And I'm thinking not necessarily for you, but for people who are listening and to try to understand and from an awareness perspective, because I might be worried as somebody that's new in an organization that I'll be judged for a thing. Or I'm going to go out and do a presentation on the main stage and I've never done this before and I'm nervous and I don't know how people are going to take me. I mean, are there insights that you can share about when I may or may not want to be at different levels on this iceberg?
Yeah, and just to provide context for anybody who isn't familiar with it, DEI practitioners often talk about identity as an iceberg, and that an iceberg is only a small part visible above the waterline, and then there's a tremendous amount of us that is hidden, that is parts of our identity that are not obvious when we walk into a room, and I actually have quite a few of those, right? I am Jewish, you can't see that per se, right? I'm in the LGBTQ community, you can't see that per se. And then I'm also Latina, and I have lighter skin. I don't speak with an accent. So there's a lot about me that is hidden. And one of the aspects of my identity that is the most visible, people don't necessarily understand or know how to categorize, which is a birthmark. And when you notice it, sometimes it's the only thing you notice because you can't figure it out just yet. And that's not true for everybody, but it happens. And so those moments where you talk about the desire to have the privilege of blending in, I think about, and this isn't true for me, but if I was thinking about other people with really visible differences, a job interview.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm sure there are great studies, and there's 2 great organizations or 3 I can point to that work in the facial difference area. One is called About Face, another is called My Face, and then another is called Faces. But I'm sure there's some great data that shows when you have a facial difference, it's harder to do things like get a job. And that's not necessarily whether it's that we're not qualified or that people are so offended by our difference, it's that it's hard to categorize us in your brain. It's sort of I don't know what I'm looking at and I'm spending more time perceiving than I am actually learning about you. So in a situation like a job interview where you talked about being new in a place of employment, there may be a desire to blend in. There may be a desire for the person to say, I want people to understand and value me for me first. And somebody in the chat, Amanda, said something really spot on. She said, you are the energy that animates your unique physical body. You are not your body. And this is so critical. I think about people who have a facial difference that is acquired. Or that changes over time. For example, I've met many people who've even come up to me to talk to me who have vitiligo, and that's loss of pigment in areas, and it changes over time. And it's something we sort of have to sit with, really have to sit with. And it's almost like the affirmations that we tell ourselves of, I am not my body. But the thing I would add to that is the thing that makes me unique is valuable, is beneficial.
So what's interesting here is that someone put in the comment, I'm still trying to figure out the point of this. And so thank you for putting that in there. And the reason I wanted to raise it now is while we might be talking about facial difference, something that bigger that we're talking about is this idea that we see people, we classify people. We do this automatically. This isn't a shaming, judging thing. This is just our brains at work. Over time, we develop stories and identities and understandings and experiences. And based on those experiences, we know how something is supposed to go. Like we know how to drive without having to think about it because we've learned it over time, that automatic processing. what I'm talking about is essentially unconscious bias, which is I see people, I can tell if they are in a wheelchair, for example. I know that person has a disability. I don't know the extent. Maybe they can walk. Maybe they aren't ambulatory at all. I don't know. But I know how to, I think I know how to respond to that person because I have some practice there.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's one thing to acknowledge. But the other part of this conversation is I come across an unexpected difference. Even if I know it exists, we were talking at the very beginning about, I said, what's the name of the term when people lose their hair? And you said alopecia, which I couldn't remember. And that's a difference that I'm aware of, but I myself find shocking or confusing. There are a couple of different experiences or feelings that I might have. And all of this has to do with, some of it anyway, bias. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think our biases are shaped by our lived experience, right? What we have been taught, who we've been surrounded by, what the media shows us, all of those things. If you don't have much experience with someone with a difference like this, you may not see how much it shapes their interactions with the world. And so part of our biases may also include not understanding how important something is. For example, when a person says, you know, who may be underrepresented or from a marginalized community, you had a team meeting, and after the meeting they say to you, gosh, that was so hard. I felt like I was talked over the whole time. And it's hard being the one and only of something. Our lack of experience may say, why would you think that's the reason you were talked over?
Right.
But that person gets the feedback constantly, right? That their difference is, you know, one of the reasons that they're treated a certain way. So it's our lack of experience with that. It's our inability to identify with that says, I don't understand why that matters or why it's a big deal, right? And
Yeah.
then that shapes our lens so tremendously. And so the same way of not understanding the value of it is the bias says I'm placing a different value on it than maybe, you know, is applicable to you. So for example, a stereotype, right? I'm Latina. I had a supervisor at work. I was 4 minutes late to work, 4 minutes. And she said, oh, you're here on, you show up on Hispanic time. That's a stereotype, right? That's based in a bias,
Mm-hmm.
right? So and then the question of, well, I don't know why this matters or why we're talking about it is totally valid, because it's not that more than one person is probably wondering that, right? But it says that I don't have enough experience with that bias, with that stereotype, with the lived experience of having a facial difference to yet understand the weight of it, right? And that's right. Some of us are in that place, and I understand that.
Yeah, and so I mean that's the very nature of bias. You have here beauty bias, height bias, age bias, and what's really interesting about all of these is I think most of us are familiar with age bias because it's also called ageism. But I think many of us don't recognize that there is a beauty standard. It's different in every culture and society, but there's a beauty standard, and the farther people move away from that, and it's entirely subjective. But based on what I think it is and what I'm familiar with, as people move farther and farther away from that, we tend to see these people as less intelligent, less, I don't know, competent, less friendly, less approachable. But we don't realize we're doing it. Or the height bias, which is if you are really tall or really short, some of those similar things happen. In fact, this is a perfect time to open up this poll because those are the only those we talked generally about unconscious bias and talked about some of the other ones.
Yeah,
Sorry, go ahead.
I think things like beauty bias, like you said, each culture has a standard for what they think is beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
And there are great studies that show that then comes with some unearned advantages, right? And so if we think about a person who does not look like the typical or the norm, you can imagine then it might come with some unearned obstacles, with them moving through the world. It's sort of like, let's take beauty bias and flip it on its head and say, what is the experience of not looking like the typical people's
Not being so-called quote unquote beautiful.
Or even, right, whether it's not being beautiful or it's even having a difference that says this is not the norm, so I don't necessarily understand it yet.
I'm closing this one down in 3, 2, and 1. Can you see the results?
We can. A lot of familiarity with unconscious bias, generally age bias, and almost half with the other two biases. That's great.
Yeah, that's great. But it's also these responses are, it's pretty common to be most familiar with unconscious bias and then age bias, and then the other two less so. But these things are all at play and they're happening. And part of bias means it's sort of how our brain is wired, and it's not necessarily, nothing about it is particularly intentional, right? And so building awareness about it is how we then mitigate the impacts of it.
Right. We're never not going to be biased. I think it just is a matter of understanding when it's showing up for us.
Mm-hmm.
When you were talking earlier about bias, what I was thinking about, you gave the example of the person and the feeling like they were talked over. And I think the importance, you've even used the phrase lived experience several times today. And I think it's really important to understand what that means, because too often other people's experience are marginalized, minimized, or dismissed because they shouldn't feel that way, or there's nothing to it, or whatever the case may be. And if I've been in meetings, so I'm going to follow your example. If I've been in meetings and I work in, say, a predominantly male organization, let's say it's not about race, it's about a gender. And I'm in these meetings and I'm constantly noticing that just my ideas never seem to be heard. If that is my experience, then respecting that that is my experience and meeting me there, let's say you're giving me feedback as a coach, or I'm coming to you as a colleague for feedback, rather than saying, Jina, that's just silly, you shouldn't feel that way. Acknowledging that that is how I feel, that is my lived experience, and then helping coach me to where you think I can get to from that, or how I can work through that. I think that's really important, because otherwise, aren't we marginalizing the marginalized?
Yeah, absolutely. I think too, when I teach about microaggressions, one of the types of microaggressions is called micro-invalidations.
Yes.
Right? And it's saying, when a person alerts you to my difference appears to be creating this outcome or this reaction, when they alert you to that difference, right, your role as an ally or supporter, a colleague, a coach, is to say, I acknowledge that first, right?
We don't want it to be invisible, right? That's not we're not asking to be invisible.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And instead of saying, is that really happening? That's probably not what's happening. I'm sure that's nobody's intention. That type of reaction is an invalidation of that person's experience. And that's when we talk about lived experience, is my lived experience is true, right? Your lived experience is true, and the same for every person on this call, because it is yours. As soon as somebody else says, no, it's not, it's like we're stepping over that line of my personhood versus your personhood, right? And I think coming from a place of saying your experience is real and true and is entirely yours, I think that's where we start to get to a place of where people can actually speak in a way of psychological safety, rather than say, well, if I say this, everybody's going to diminish what my experience was.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that's what's most important about that is, somebody said this recently, don't should on anybody. And I thought that is a great way to look at it, because the minute I project on and assign value to what you're saying your experience is, it's going to shut me down. And for those, psychological safety is the space where I feel safe to ask questions and speak up and share my thoughts and experiences without the risk of being shamed or judged or marginalized or dismissed. And so that's really important. I want to shift for a moment because there's a story you tell, and I think it's two things that you shared with me. I love these pictures, by the way. Thank you for sharing them. I want to pivot to, when did you notice that you had a difference? Because to some degree, when you talk about invisibility, if you don't even notice a difference for yourself, and it's one thing to have this inherent, meaning you're born with it, but it's another thing if it is acquired. So something happens along the way. It could be an injury, it could be a health issue, it could be something in your body that is dormant for a long time. Like vitiligo isn't something that people are necessarily born with, but they may develop it over time. So can you talk about your experience? I have there's stories here. I'll let you pick the one, but about when did you come into this awareness and how do you navigate that growing up?
Yeah, so interestingly, my parents tell this story. I don't know, when you hear stories from when you're little, you don't necessarily know, are they my memories or are they somebody else's memories? But they tell this story about when I was little. So my father and my grandfather owned several Baskin Robbins stores. And so we would always have ice cream. We'd go to the mall, we'd go to Baskin Robbins, we'd have ice cream. And we're walking through a store, and I'm about 3, my dad is holding me. And he tells this story about going past a mirror, and at the time he's cleaning me up from the ice cream. And I said, and I look at myself in the mirror and I said, you missed some right here. And that was when my dad had this awareness that I had the awareness that something was different, that I saw that my face looked different than other people's faces. And I thought, oh, well, that's not supposed to be there. Or that's just different and we need to address it. And so, from then and probably much earlier, the messaging from my family and from my parents was like, oh no, that's your birthmark, or they would even say beauty mark. And it's the thing that makes you so special. And that messaging was so critical to me developing a strong sense of self, but then also being able to move through the world when I faced people's negative reactions, people's surprise or, strange kind of name calling and things. And I think that is the story of when I first noticed, but I also have memories as a child of the first time I noticed other people notice. And when you're a child, children don't have a filter, right? And so throughout my whole life, I've encountered children who would, ask a question or say something. And when you're little, sometimes school feels like that really kind of difficult, got to carve your own space, deal with the bullies. So I learned from a very young age to sort of clap back and say something and put somebody in their place. And you develop that thick skin. And I kind of compared notes with a friend who's a little person, and she is one of the funniest people I've met in my life. And she said, well, I had to learn how to put somebody in their place real quick, just at the same time as I was learning to go to school, to navigate the playground, to all of those things. So it shapes you. But now as an adult, thinking about children, I think about how do children's minds work, and how can I frame things in a way that like my parents would, right? Like they made it feel like your difference is special and important. That as an adult, when kids ask, what's on your face? I explain to them, and I first say, do you have any freckles? Right? And they might say, oh yeah, I have one and it's right here. And I say, well, I have freckles because I also have freckles on my face. And I said, they all got together and made one super freckle. And I said, do you know that a freckle makes you really special? And so the kid kind of walks around with this very, pride. And so I think so much about difference is about messaging. It's about the thing that makes you different is both important and valuable. I think that is so key.
And I think what I love about that is a sense of agency. That's what you were able to develop over time, a sense of advocating for yourself and standing confidently in who you are, with all of your differences. You know, back to that iceberg, let me bring that back up again. Back to this iceberg. I'm going to go with, and I don't know how easily people can see this, but underneath the waterline, there are all these little dots, right? All these little speckles under there. And I see some fish. And if every one of those dots represented a different dimension of our identity that was invisible, we would quickly come to understand that this is, you know, it's what we call intersectionality, that it is the combination of all of these things that make us up, but some of them weigh heavier on us than others. And those that are invisible in particular can affect that sense of agency. They can affect our confidence. They can create higher levels of anxiety and uncertainty. And so being able to understand, acknowledge, I want to say own, and then be empowered through these differences is really, really important. And I think for organizations doing D&I work, it's not just about, hey, some of our differences are visible. Some of our differences are invisible. We need to acknowledge all of our differences. It goes deeper than that. And so that's why I was grateful for you sharing so many of your stories today.
Yeah, absolutely too. I think bringing up that iceberg slide, what's interesting is the messages we get from coworkers, supervisors, anyone in our community or midst, and the media about the differences that are both visible and invisible have a tremendous impact. So if you think about, for example, if I was talking to you and I might say, okay, I see her visible points of identity and I'm aware of them, but then I start talking about something that is completely invisible and my own opinions about it, or my own eye roll about having to deal with someone who doesn't process the same and how frustrating that is. I've more effectively navigated your visible difference, but your invisible difference or your hidden identity, I've just walked through this whole minefield.
Yeah. I could have been offended 7 times in that sentence, in that joke, and you didn't know it.
Right.
Yeah, no, that's a really, really good point. I want to open our next poll because I want to make sure we're pacing them. And so, Autumn, if we can launch that poll. And then when we come back, I see the time. We've got some comments and questions, so I want to make sure we get to go to those. So maybe we can go to the intercultural development continuum. I know you wanted to touch on that. Can we cover that in a few minutes after this and then go to Q&A?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I asked this about how would you describe your reaction to unexpected facial differences in the past? And it may be any and all of these things, right? It may be different based on the different facial, the facial difference. One thing I want to say is my experience is not that of everybody with a facial difference, because some facial differences come with disability, and some facial differences come with a traumatic event, and some facial differences, have other issues or challenges associated. And so mine is not everyone's, and I think that's important to know.
Yeah, that's interesting, because when you say that, this is also true about visible differences. None of us are a monolith. The fact that I'm biracial doesn't mean my experience is the same as anyone else who's biracial. Autumn, I don't know if you want to just go ahead and close the poll and then push the results. So it'd be interesting to see the check all that apply response means a lot of them are going to be checked. I have a question for you, by the way, before we go any further. Totally interrupting my own story. How do you have suggestions on how to respond? Because I made a note earlier about, okay, never mind. I'm going to come back to this. I wrote it down. I want to make sure you have time to talk about the intercultural development of the development continuum. So please go ahead, and then I'll come back to this in the Q&A.
Yeah, well, and I think just seeing the results here too, that 51% is curious. We can go 2 ways with that, and so I want to think about that curiosity as we look at the intercultural development inventory or the intercultural development continuum. So I wanted to bring this in. This is a continuum that explains how we engage with or react to difference. And so when you think of what am I taking away from this that I can bring back to my organization, that I can apply to all different types of identity differences, if we learn about this, it says and we are in different places on this continuum when it comes to different identities or differences, right? So when we're early on in the continuum, we may miss the importance of those differences. We may miss the value of those differences, right? Or we may deny that they even exist, right? That difference is nothing and
oh, that's nothing to worry about. That's just your imagination, right?
Exactly. Then the next is polarization, to say I'm judging the difference, right? That's the, I'm my bias is
too sensitive.
Right, or my bias is taking over. And it's like a bias, I always think of your brain as a car, and your bias is the steering wheel. It's like if you let go, bias is just going to take you off right into a ditch probably. But if you put hands on that steering wheel, you can actually steer. Polarization is that judging those differences. Next is minimizing. It's saying I see the differences, but I don't necessarily value them, right? I'm going to de-emphasize them. It's saying I don't see color, right?
That's what I was going to ask you.
It's minimization. And while that sounds like a kindness to some, right? It does sound like a kindness to some. I don't see different color, and thus I treat everyone the same. What if it was, I see the differences and I work to treat everyone the same, acknowledging how those differences shape your experience? Like, whoa, that goes beyond, right? Then there's acceptance, right? Like, I deeply comprehend these differences. I accept the differences. Yep, I see them, check the box, we're there, right? And I am aware. But what if there was something past that, to instead say, I accept you, to say, I'm using this as a bridge, or I'm leveraging this difference. I'm creating an environment where your difference is important and matters, right? That's that adaptation. We're shifting and changing our place and our space to say what makes you different and unique is important and valuable. So it's a way we perceive difference, and it's something that I wanted to share for you all to take away, to bring back to your organization and explore further about how do we engage with all different types of difference, because we're not in the same place on the continuum for every aspect of identity.
Right. We're in different places along this continuum for different things that are the differences that I'm aware of and that I notice with others.
Exactly.
What I think is most powerful about this, as well as in the adaptation, what I would like to layer onto that is, when we're thinking about DEI efforts in our organizations, we should be thinking about them in terms of the space we're trying to create for the we, for all of us, as opposed to the space that we want them to feel more comfortable in. And I think that this is an important distinction, because too often the language, if we think about the way some maybe we're getting better, but we think about the way that D&I has been approached, it's about understanding and then creating space for the so-called minorities to feel comfortable here. But that isn't a space of adaptation. Right. That is a space of acceptance. And so I think that that's an important
I want to point out something from the chat too, that it speaks to your point, but I think even more so when somebody says, I just wanted to add that my response of uncomfortable was that I didn't want to react or say something that would make the other person uncomfortable. And so there's really positive intent there, right? They're saying, I don't want to do the wrong thing and offend, hurt your feelings, or make you feel more different. Right. And so sometimes that puts us in a category of I then do nothing. Right. And that's very common. And I don't want to say that that is bad, because it is not. It's just not ready yet. Right. And so what does it take for us to get to a place to say, I'm willing to be uncomfortable so that you're more comfortable? And I think that may be what the respondent was getting at, is I'm uncomfortable and I don't want to make you less comfortable. But I think when we then say, how would this person like to be treated? Well, I can only know that if I engage with them really effectively, if I build trust across the difference. One of the things I teach about quite a bit in my practice is allyship. And the first step of allyship that is often overlooked is questioning your own discomfort. It's saying, I'm going to go there and talk about this thing, and I'm going to let you, the person with the difference, or the person who's underrepresented, dictate to me what is right, what makes sense. I'm willing to get it wrong and learn something, make a mistake, and move forward. It's questioning my own comfort so that I can show up fully for and with the other person.
Thank you. That is fantastic. Allyship, that's a whole nother topic that I would hope to bring to the program again. We talked about it like 2 years ago, but thank you for reminding me. So Mike, now to the Q&A. So there's a question in here. Can you pattern for the audience how we would better respond to a person in that recent example? Instead of saying, no, you shouldn't feel that way, no one meant to make you feel that way. What is a kinder response? And to that, I'm going to add, because this is what I was thinking, how can I recover from that moment? So I just said something about your birthmark and realized to my own horror that perhaps that was offensive. How do we help somebody recover when it's, I didn't mean to make you feel that way, or oops, I can't believe I just said that.
So one of the first things to think about, let's say not when you're in the situation, but to pull back and think about, is intent versus impact, right? So we sometimes conflate intent with impact. And when the person says, hey, that was really offensive, you want to explain your intent. That is normal, right? Because we're feeling misunderstood. But if we pull that apart and we say, okay, I'm going to put my intent over here for a few minutes, and I'm going to hear the impact. I'm going to show up for the person and say, I really want, like even just saying, I really want to hear what you're saying because your experience is valuable, because your experience is very important here, right? First, just saying, I'm creating the listening environment and I'm validating you. Oftentimes, and I know this is hard to hear for people, we can't even talk about our intent unless there's trust built, because there's no place where it can easily be heard or navigated unless there's trust. I talk about trust as deposits we make in the bank with each other, right? So that when there's a conflict, when there's a misunderstanding, you have something to pull from, right? Like, oh, I got to pull from my deposits. That's when we can start saying, you know, can we talk about my intention here, because it was different than the impact, but the impact was so important, right? I don't want to take away from that. So I think navigating that with some trust building is so important. I think in the moment, validate, listen, show up for the person, and avoid diminishing, and just hang in when something is hard to hear.
Acknowledge is key. All right, so now this is a long one. This came in a little while ago, but I want to read this. So it says, I'll be honest, what interested me in this webinar is the fact that I am a middle-aged white man with vitiligo. Due to my vitiligo, I've been discriminated against. I've been in job interviews and have known the exact moment when it was noticed and knew the interview had effectively ended because they were jumping through hoops from then on. This is that thing where you were talking about, you notice that they notice. And when this is your lived experience and you see it over and over and over again, it creates an impact in you. He said that the interviewer couldn't take his eyes off the spots around on his hands and then around his mouth. See, my screen keeps moving. So I'm going to fast forward. When I've tried to express that due to my vitiligo, I can relate at some level to the skin difference discrimination, I've been shut down. So I just wanted you to hear all of this. He said, thank you for bringing this up. There are quite a few comments in here, more than questions. So I don't know if something in here you want to respond to. I don't know if you want to respond to that one.
I want to respond to that gentleman. Interestingly, people with facial differences will approach me, and more often than not, it's a person with vitiligo asking if I have vitiligo. And it's such an interesting kinship, but there's overlap, there's differences in that. One is progressive, one isn't. But the experience of noticing other people notice and then saying, now all is lost, because that's all they're perceiving.
They're distracted by noticing, and you can tell that they're distracted by noticing. Is that what you're talking about?
Exactly. And that experience is so important as a takeaway for listeners who are saying, well, what am I taking from this, or what can I bring back, is getting to a place where in your, oftentimes we have interview training, right? To say, how can I hang in when something unexpected, when I perceive something unexpected? how can I create a space for difference that is safe here so I can really see that what the value that person brings. So thank you so much for sharing that.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Somebody just dropped in a really important question. I attempt to communicate to everyone in the same way. This means making differences irrelevant. Are you teaching us to make note of the differences? I am confused.
Yeah, interestingly, so I think there's a difference between making note of it and making it the other person's responsibility to explain it, right? And saying, I recognize that our differences mean that our life experience is different, and that matters. I think that's where we're headed versus saying, I want to point out every single time.
Or ignore them or act like they aren't there. I think ignoring them is just as bad as over pointing them out, if
Yeah.
that makes any sense.
I oftentimes find when people point it out with me, the thing that feels most successful or welcome is when, we're either having a one-on-one and we're not in a big group, or they kind of, say to me and they're like, oh, I noticed your birthmark. That, it's so unique. I really love it.
Yeah.
And not that I require compliments at all times, but rather that's the kind of acknowledgement to at least say, and in a job interview is not appropriate, but we met at a conference. If that happened at a conference, I'd say, oh, thank you, and move forward. Beyond that, I don't need somebody to notice
Right.
unless attached to something positive and make me aware of it. Because
Right.
truly, like people, and I really believe this, people's negative or problematic perceptions of you are really not your business. So,
or not something you should have to manage.
Exactly. If they're not your responsibility, they're the other person's responsibility. And so they'll have to, they sort them out, just like we all sort out how we perceive difference.
Yeah, thank you. That's fantastic. I couldn't agree more. Well, listen, we're at the end of time. I'm going to give you a moment here to share some final thoughts. But before we do, I just want to remind everybody this is a biweekly webinar series. And in 2 weeks, Stephen Sloan's joining me to talk about humane leadership. He wrote a book with that title, and we'll be sharing a little bit more about what that means, and that can help us all become more inclusive leaders, but all of us. And then 2 weeks after that, Dr. Lee will be joining me to talk through understanding so many of these different credentials and certifications and licenses that people have with respect to DEI work, because like other business areas of specializations, there's a whole lot more to this than just understanding unconscious bias. So with that, let's go ahead and open that last poll. And while that poll is open, Adrianna, you want to have share a final thought?
Yeah, I think if there's one thing that I would hope that people take away from this session, it is that there are differences that we don't necessarily engage with every day. And what would it look like if we created a space where that we could confront our own perceptions of those differences, where we could kind of grapple with things that we may not as easily be able to categorize. And also there's, I think some of the questions showed too, there's not one right answer, but there is a willingness to engage, and there's a willingness to make a mistake, to learn something, and to move forward with that new knowledge. And I think that's something that's so critical.
Yeah, thank you for adding that, because I think all of us know what it feels like. We've all had a moment in our lives where something we did or something we said, an action or an expression, had an unintended impact on somebody, or someone else was surprised by that. And I think that if we can tap into that feeling of what that felt like, then we can start to get a better sense of what you feel like when people are asking you about your birthmark, in a way that is either not as kind as they intend, or that might feel thoughtless. So I think just having that awareness, I think, is powerful. I see the poll is still, the poll is closed. So with that, thank you, everyone. Adrianna, thank you so much for joining me today. And thank you all for joining us. You are welcome to reach out to either one of us. Our information is there in the handout. And I hope you found this helpful.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a great conversation, as ours always are. And thank you so much for those who engaged and watched and asked some really great questions and had some great comments.